Well, that happened right away after we landed. I'm on the moon, I'm on the moon, and you couldn't, could.
For 50 years, astronaut Charles Duke has carried a silence deeper than space itself. He was there, the youngest man to walk on the moon, a witness to a world no one has truly seen. While the world remembers flags and footprints, Duke remembers something different, something that never made it into the mission reports. Now, as he nears 90, he's breaking that silence, not to chase glory, but to share what time and history have tried to forget. Because what he saw on the moon wasn't just another step for mankind. It was a moment that changed how he saw everything, including himself. The invisible astronaut's dual vision. Before Charles Duke ever saw the moon with his own eyes, the world already knew his voice. It was calm, measured, and unmistakably Southern. During the summer of 1969, millions of people heard that voice as they watched humanity take its first steps beyond Earth. When Neil Armstrong declared, "The Eagle has landed," it was Duke who replied from Mission Control in Houston. "Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." "Tranquility, we copy you on the ground." "Roger. Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." That one sentence placed him in the heart of history. Yet the man who spoke it remained unseen, a presence known only through static and signal. While Armstrong and Aldrin became the faces of triumph, Duke stayed behind the console, the invisible astronaut guiding others through the moment every explorer dreams of. As Capcom, our capsule communicator, his job was to be the single voice between Earth and the astronauts in space. Every word carried the weight of millions listening. Every pause could be misread. Every tone could alter the calm on the other side of the radio. In that pressure, Duke learned to steady his breath, to turn emotion into precision. He became the lifeline between two worlds, a translator of courage and fear. But that position came with its own burden. He could describe the moon, analyze it, and monitor the voices of those who walked upon it. But he could not touch it himself. To guide another man's first steps while standing on solid ground created a strange ache, one that stayed with him long after the applause faded. He later admitted that when the transmission ended, the silence in the room was almost unbearable. He had carried the tension of space inside his chest, and when it was over, he realized he had been holding his own breath the whole time. That feeling never truly left him. It grew quietly through the years of training that followed. Duke was a man who lived two realities, the one behind the glass and the one waiting on the lunar horizon. When his turn finally arrived with Apollo 16, he carried both within him. Few people in history have experienced that kind of dual vision, to be both the unseen guide and the man who would later leave footprints on the same ground he once watched through screens. During those early years of the Apollo program, Duke had become a silent witness to greatness. He had seen Armstrong's nerves steady, heard Aldrin's measured tone, and felt the weight of Mission Control's collective heartbeat. He knew what success sounded like, but not yet what it felt like beneath his own boots. That contrast shaped everything that followed. When he finally stepped onto the moon, it was not just a continuation of training or duty. It was a deeply personal reconciliation. He was no longer the voice sending others into the unknown. He was the one standing there hearing his own words echo through a helmet speaker surrounded by a silence so absolute it felt alive. The experience gave him a perspective no one else could claim. A kind of mirror between two worlds, earthbound control and lunar solitude. For decades, Duke kept those reflections private. His name faded behind louder legends buried under a history that preferred heroes who planted flags and posed for cameras. But as the years passed and the echoes of Apollo grew dimmer, he began to realize that his story, the one that spanned both sides of the mission, still mattered. Now in his late 80s, he speaks not for attention but for truth. His story is not about mystery or myth. It is about understanding. Because when Charles Duke tells us that we missed something about the moon, it is not a casual memory. It is a perspective of a man who once watched a dream unfold from the ground and then lived it with his own hands. And what he saw there, what defied everything he expected after years of simulations and briefings, became the reason he could no longer remain silent. A family left on the moon. Among the dust and stone of the moon lies something deeply human, something that does not belong to science or machinery. It is a small photograph left gently on the surface by astronaut Charles Duke. To this day, he remains the only person in human history to leave a family portrait on another world. For years, the image was described simply as a touching gesture, a father's way of bringing his loved ones along for the journey. But for Duke, that photograph carried far more weight than sentiment. It was, in his own words, a kind of message, one that few understood, and even fewer were meant to see. On its front, it showed his wife and 2 sons smiling beneath a blue sky. But on the back, there was something unusual, a faint code written in ink, an internal sequence known only to NASA's communication network. Duke later revealed that he was never supposed to leave anything behind except equipment. Yet, this one exception was quietly allowed. He said the permission came during training after a brief conversation with his superiors. No paperwork, no explanation, only a single instruction, one object, and no questions asked. Decades later, that choice still puzzled him. When Apollo 16 prepared for departure, Duke oversaw the final staging area where all tools and samples were gathered. Before climbing back into the lunar module, he placed a photograph beside a small rock roughly 7 m from the rover. That rock, according to mission records, was marked with a code not found in any official catalog, and its location was no accident. It was a very point where earlier readings had shown strange magnetic interference, a place the crew had quietly adjusted their receiver to measure more precisely. Later data would reveal that during the final 40 minutes on the surface, several unexplained tremors appeared in the seismic logs. They were noted, but never explained. Duke never said they were connected, only that the photograph was left because it had to be. For decades, the image lay forgotten in public memory, mentioned only as trivia on television or in documentaries. But in a quiet interview years later, Duke confessed that for him, the picture had never been about publicity. "Each of us has our own way of keeping quiet," he said. "For me, it was a photograph." When asked why he left it there, he paused for a long moment before answering. "The photograph stayed there so I could leave." Perhaps that small piece of paper was his way of saying goodbye not only to his family but to something within himself. It marked the spot where his duty ended and his silence began, the place where the man who guided others to the moon finally left a part of himself behind. The encounter in the shadows of Descartes Highlands. The Descartes Highlands were unlike any place humanity had ever touched. Chosen as a landing site for Apollo 16, the plateau was rough, jagged, and geologically unpredictable. NASA believed its uneven terrain could reveal the moon's oldest secrets. But for Charles Duke, it would become the setting for something far stranger than science. From the moment they landed, the instrument began to behave irregularly. The readings wavered, as if something beneath the surface was interfering with their equipment. In one internal crew memo, Duke wrote, "We saw faint points of light moving slowly, then disappearing behind the rocks." At first, he thought it might be reflections, but the movements were too deliberate, too controlled. Shortly after landing, a probe detected an unusual signal coming from the northern ridge of the plateau. Duke and Commander John Young were instructed to adjust the lunar module position by a few hundred meters to avoid the area. According to Duke, that order was not part of the original plan, and Mission Control was only informed after the maneuver had already been made. During their second moonwalk, while traveling across the highlands in the lunar rover, their transmitter suddenly filled with static. For 7 minutes, the connection between the surface and Houston vanished into a haze of interference. The astronauts tried repeatedly to call back, but only a hiss answered. All systems showed normal operation. Duke requested permission to stop and check the transmitter, but ground control told him to continue. Later, in his flight log, he wrote, "A sound like metal striking metal, not from the equipment." The corresponding recording was later confirmed to exist in NASA's technical archives. Yet, after the mission, that specific portion of audio was missing from public release. Duke maintained that everyone in Mission Control heard it clearly during the live feed. Hours later, near the end of their final moonwalk, the portable seismometer began showing irregular movement. Duke recorded the moment in his handwritten notes. "The oscillations are increasing, like something moving underneath." He wanted to investigate further, but Mission Control ordered him to return to the module. Time was running out. He later admitted it was the only moment during the mission when he felt truly afraid. "We were standing on the quietest land known to man," he said, "but underfoot everything was trembling." Back inside the module, Duke quickly inspected the samples. One stood out from the rest. It was darker, smoother, and colder than the other rocks collected from the site. Its sample code did not match any of the official records. After returning to Earth, it quietly disappeared from the Lunar catalog, which listed exactly 200 pounds of material. That stone was no longer among them. In a later interview, Duke remarked tersely, "There's something they took, and I know exactly what it is." He refused to elaborate, but hinted that the data tied to it was locked under the highest classification level. When questioned years later about the communication blackout, he replied, "We never lost contact. We were cut off from the main channel." Records of the mission show that the seismic fluctuations and the timing of the blackout matched Duke's diary entries almost exactly. His private notes referred to an unusual activity lasting about 20 minutes, encoded under a symbol that took decades to decipher. When asked about it at a conference in Texas, Duke simply said, "Everything we do is recorded, but not everything is kept." His words left the room silent. The final entries in his Descartes diary showed a change in tone. The neat, steady handwriting turned hurried, uneven. The last sentence read, "Seen, heard, understood what they want to hide." No further notes after this. When Apollo 16 returned to Earth, Duke's life did not follow the same path as the others. While his fellow astronauts rested, gave interviews, and celebrated their success, something in him shifted. For Duke, the mission had not ended on the moon. It had only gone quiet. The silent triumph of Apollo 16. While the world still celebrates Apollo 11, the first step, the flag, the words that echoed through time, Charles Duke has never forgotten the quieter mission that followed. Apollo the 16th may not have captured the headlines, but its achievements reshaped everything we know about the moon. The tragedy, Duke often says, is that almost nobody remembers. What he and John Young accomplished was not a repetition of past glory. They built something new, something that history almost buried beneath the noise of fame. Apollo 16 set up the very first telescope on the moon, not in orbit, not on Earth, but resting on the lunar soil itself. It was a far ultraviolet observatory built to capture light that our atmosphere blocks. For the first time in history, humanity looked at the stars through a window unfiltered by air. Duke later called it a window into the universe, though most textbooks never mention it. The mission lasted 71 hours, nearly 3 full days on the surface. There was no rest, no sightseeing. The astronauts drove the lunar rover across 16 miles of broken terrain, drilled into the crust, and filled their sample bags until their arms ached. When they left, they carried 209 pounds of rock and dust, some of the most geologically diverse material ever collected by humankind. Even today, laboratories continue to analyze fragments Duke once held in his hands. Their equipment was extraordinary. Apollo 16 carried X-ray and gamma-ray spectrometers, devices that mapped the moon's chemical composition, and uncovered traces of iron, titanium, and magnesium. Those findings would go on to redefine theories about the moon formation. Yet when people remember Apollo, they recall 11, 13, or 17. 16 remains a ghost between them. Duke admits it stings. The mission lacked the drama of Apollo 13's near disaster and the poetry of Armstrong's first words. But in terms of science, it was unmatched. "If we forget the science," Duke once said, "then we've missed the reason we went at all." Still, beneath the discipline and data, Duke was human. In the midst of exhaustion and tension, he and Young invented their own form of relief, what they called the Lunar Olympics. During a brief break, they tried leaping in low gravity like high jumpers. Duke soared higher than expected, crashed backward, and nearly damaged his life support pack. He later admitted it was stupid, but it reminded them that they were still men, not machines. Even in those lighter moments, Duke never lost sight of the mission. Every mile driven and every rock collected mattered. And yet the world remembers the flag, the footprint, and the radio calls, but not the telescope, not the discoveries, not the scientists who kept working long after the cameras turned away. That silence has driven Duke for decades. He has spoken in schools, at museums, and in interviews, determined to restore Apollo 16's rightful place in history. Time, he knows, is not on his side. Apollo wasn't just flags and politics, he says. It was about unlocking secrets hidden in dust and stone. Even now, more than 50 years later, data from that mission continues to be studied and cited. In a way, the mission never ended. For Duke, it remains alive, a legacy still orbiting the truth. And perhaps that is what drives him most. Not the glory of walking on the moon, but the fear that one day people might stop believing they ever did. The contract of silence. When Charles Duke returned from the moon, he expected rest, recovery, and reunion with his family. Instead, within 48 hours of splashdown, he was summoned to a private meeting unlike any other. It lasted more than 3 hours and included only 3 officials besides himself. The meeting was not held at the Johnson Space Center, but in a secure facility under direct control of the Air Force. There he was presented with a document stamped with the highest level of government secrecy. It was not a debriefing, not a report. It was a pledge. The paper demanded absolute silence regarding all unusual phenomena observed during Apollo 16. He was instructed never to mention them again. Not in interviews, not in hearings, not even before Congress. Attached to the document was a handwritten note from one of the men in the room. It read, "You have done your duty. Do not let what you saw ruin the rest of your life." Duke signed. The document was immediately confiscated. "I signed something I could never take back," he later said in a private interview. "They did not ask me to lie. They asked me to keep quiet." From that day forward, Duke's life was no longer his own. His public appearances were quietly monitored. Whenever he attended conferences or press events, a representative from the Federal Censorship Agency was present. Questions that strayed from technical topics were either cut from recordings or simply never broadcast. To outsiders, it seemed like a routine procedure, but Duke knew the difference. He had seen what happened to another astronaut who once spoke too freely about a strange sighting on the lunar surface, suspended from public duty for 2 years. Duke never made that mistake. "I know what they can do," he once whispered to a colleague. "I have seen enough to know my limits." The pressure followed him everywhere. At an aviation conference years later, a reporter suddenly asked about a communication blackout during Apollo 16. Duke froze, shifted the topic, and ended the session within minutes. When asked years later why he avoided the question, he replied, "I did not shy away because I had nothing to say. I did not have a choice." The silence was not only official, it became personal. Duke received anonymous phone calls reminding him of his promise. "Keep your word," the voices said. Once during a business trip, he discovered his personal documents had been opened. Though there was no sign of a break-in, he never filed a report, but he began keeping detailed notes of every strange incident. When asked why he agreed to sign the pledge, Duke's answer was simple and firm. It was not an option. For decades, he stayed within the narrow boundaries set for him. Every interview, every statement passed through layers of approval. He never published a single piece of information that had not been cleared. In a recording never publicly released, he admitted, "I knew what would happen if I spoke. I also knew what would happen if I didn't. I chose to let others live in peace." The toll was heavy. His wife later revealed that he often woke in the middle of the night, silent, pacing through the house as if searching for something. When asked about those restless nights, Duke never explained. He only said, "I saw something I should not have seen, and they do not want me to repeat it." For him, silence was not only obedience, it was protection. It kept his family safe, his career intact, and his conscience barely at rest. But from that moment onward, the stories he never told began to take on a life of their own. And it all began with a dream that came to him the night before he left Earth. The dream that never ended. A week before Apollo 16 launched, Charles Duke fell ill. The fever came quickly and forced him into quarantine. The doctors called it a severe flu, but Duke described it differently. He said it felt like his body knew something his mind refused to accept. Confined to his quarters, he drifted in and out of sleep until one night, a dream came that would never fully leave him. He later called it the scariest thing before the flight. In the dream, he stood on a barren plain beneath a sky the color of ash. In the distance, a lunar module leaned at an angle, its shadow stretching longer than seemed possible. He called out for his crew, but no one answered. Then the ground beneath him began to tremble, soft at first, then pulsing metal against metal. The vibration climbed through his legs, through his chest, until he woke in panic. It took several minutes for him to realize he was still in Houston. The air smelled of disinfectant, not dust. His wife later wrote in her diary that he looked pale, distant, and deeply unsettled. When she asked what was wrong, he told her only, "I'm not sure I'll come back." It was the first and only time she had ever seen him afraid. After the mission, Duke rarely spoke of the dream, but in private, he confessed that it had never ended. "The dream didn't stop when I woke up," he said. He became convinced that it was connected to what happened later. The signal interference, the shaking ground, and the strange presence near the Descartes Plateau. In the years after Apollo 16, the dream returned again and again. Each time the same image replayed, the module falling, a spreading darkness and the metallic hum beneath the surface. Eventually, it began to invade his waking hours. He slept less, pacing through the night, waiting for the first light of morning before he could rest. "I knew something was watching," he told a friend quietly. "It wasn't on the moon. It was inside me." The change in Duke was unmistakable. Once a precise engineer and disciplined officer, he began to withdraw from technical work. He turned to community service, faith, and public speaking. Many thought he had found peace, but those closest to him knew better. "There are things beyond what humans can explain," he would sometimes say during his lectures. His voice low, his eyes far away. A former colleague recalled asking Duke what had changed him. He answered slowly, "I saw something that wasn't in the training plan." When pressed to explain, Duke simply replied, "You weren't there. You wouldn't understand." As the years passed and his body grew frail, the dreams grew stronger. After his 80th birthday, he would often wake in the dark and walk silently through his home, stopping to stare at old photographs as if searching for a familiar face in them. He never really left that place. His wife once said in a private recording, Duke came to believe the dream was not imagination or fear, but memory, something recorded deep within him. "I didn't dream that I was lost," he said once. "I dreamed that where I was, something was unfinished." His family and friends noticed the quiet weight he carried. He remained kind, patient, but there was always a distance in his eyes, as if a part of him was still orbiting another world. For years, he buried what he had seen beneath faith and duty. But when he reached 90, Duke decided to break the silence once and for all. He did not want to tell a story. He wanted to leave a record. The final confession. At 90 years old, Charles Duke sat alone in front of a camera. The video ran nearly 20 minutes, unedited and unscripted. His voice was steady, slow, deliberate, each word sounding like it had been rehearsed in his mind for half a century. "I have been silent as they asked me to be," he began, "for 50 years. He described what he and John Young had discovered during Apollo 16, a zone of strange signals roughly 500 m from the lunar module. During a test of the seismograph, Duke detected an oscillating pulse repeating every 11 seconds. For 17 minutes, the reading spiked without explanation, no movement, no communication, no known cause. Then he saw it. He spoke of a cylindrical object half buried in dust, roughly as tall as he was. It was smooth, metallic, and dented at the center, as if something had struck it long ago. It did not appear on any map, and no report mentioned it. According to Duke, he found it while Young was still in orbit. He had only minutes to observe before being ordered to return. "It wasn't hours," he said quietly, "and it wasn't a rock." When he turned to collect a nearby sample, his radio crackled violently for 4 seconds, then went silent. The sound was never recorded on the public tapes, but Duke insisted the original data still existed. "They just never released it," he said. He called that moment the instant I realized something larger than us was happening. Duke did not demand belief. "I don't need anyone to believe me," he said. "I just need someone to record this." After the video, he refused every interview request. His family confirmed that it was the last time he ever spoke of Apollo 16. For Charles Duke, the moon was never just a place of exploration. It was a mirror reflecting something in humanity that still trembles beneath the surface. He left footprints on another world, but a piece of that world never stopped following him home. And in the end, it was not the dust, the data, or the distance that haunted him. It was a signal, the one he knew he had sent, the one no one ever answered. The last keeper of Apollo's flame, Charles Duke knows the clock is ticking. Out of the 12 men who once walked on the moon, only 4 remain. He is one of them. That truth sits heavily on his shoulders. Each year, the weight grows sharper, not as fear, but as duty. He has said that when his generation is gone, the Apollo story will pass from memory into history. And with that shift comes a danger of distortion. He wants to make sure the truth is not lost. In recent years, Duke has stepped out of the quiet shadows where he once hid. He attends more public events, gives interviews, visits schools, and sits down for long conversations with museums and documentarians. When asked why, his answer is always the same. It's my turn to tell it right. He knows that no textbook can truly capture what it was like. The silence, the strange stillness of the lunar plain, the fragile curve of Earth glowing like a blue ornament in the blackness. Those memories, he says, will vanish when he does, unless he shares them now. At the South Carolina State Museum, Duke once told a group of students that walking on the moon was never about planting a flag. It was about expanding the edge of what humanity believed was possible. He wants young people to see themselves as explorers, as dreamers, as inheritors of that same boundless curiosity that once lifted him from the ground. That is why the Artemis program excites him. To Duke, it is not just a mission. It is a continuation of a bridge between eras, a chance for new astronauts to go further, to treat the moon not as a finish line, but as a proving ground. He believed the lessons written in lunar dust will guide humanity's first steps on Mars. Apollo wasn't the end. He says it was the beginning. But as he nears 90, Duke also speaks more openly about time and how little of it remains. He no longer hides from mortality. Instead, he looks at it with the same steady calm he once used to face the unknown. What he fears most is not death, but forgetting. He wants his grandchildren and their generation after them to inherit the truth of Apollo, not as myth, not as a puzzle of conspiracies, but as a foundation for what comes next. He hopes that when they watch Artemis rise into the sky, they will see the same thread that connects every mission, every footprint, every risk taken for the sake of wonder. And when that day comes, perhaps they will think of him as a man who once looked back at Earth from another world, who carried a dream that never ended, and who left behind a message for those still reaching for the stars. For Charles Duke, the moon was never the destination. It was a beginning, and humanity's story is still being written among the stars. For 50 years, Charles Duke kept the truth sealed behind silence. Now that it's finally spoken, we have to ask, was it discovery or was it a warning? What do you believe really happened on the moon? Let us know in the comments.